Welcome to Debut, a fusion of storytelling and play. And if you don't know what Debut is, well, where you been for a while? We actually have three amazing storytellers who tell a story for the very first time for you. I'm Kevin Cordi. I am the host, but also a crazy practitioner of play. And we like to do debut interviews so you know a little bit more about the tellers that are coming on. And it is indeed a special time to introduce this amazing teller. Let me tell you about this teller. He hails, right now he's in the Midwest, Kansas City in particular. He's an improviser, he's a storyteller, he's a veteran of over 30 comedy and fringe festivals. He's garnered many awards, including Best Stand-Up Variety Performance. He was number one, his comedy album on Amazon. He's been on NBC Chicago Fire and a number of different things. And that's what's in print that I'm telling you. But let me tell you about this teller. This teller has a rapid fire sense of humor, but he can also take those really tender moments and let them stay longer so that we feel the impact. We always bring him when we were running the Columbus Improv Festival back because honestly, he's brand new every time. He comes in with amazing ability, both within comedy, stand-up, storytelling, and most of all, he's not afraid to share what he knows so that people continue to do the art. He is a consummate performer, and he's my friend and colleague. I would like to bring in Jamie Campbell. Welcome, Jamie.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you for having me here and those kind words. That really, I'm going to cry. I'll cry later. But
there's room for tears in Debut. Let me ask a question. In some way, this is always my starting question. How did story find you or you find story?
Wow, that's such an interesting question because I think even when I was a child and I lived with a single parent and we were on welfare and didn't have a lot coming in, I would love to grab a notebook and just start to tell some sort of a tale. And I think it was just that need for escapism. Part of it because we were, poor and I literally needed to imagine putting myself somewhere. And part of it was because we couldn't afford a lot of entertainment. So we had to make our own entertainment. And so, I would, try to write a story that might entertain my mom or my sister and then vice versa. I didn't really find story as a performer until as a stand-up, when I originally began my career in Chicago, I started finding myself tired and bored of just doing setup punchline jokes. And I was auditioning for a show called Impress These Apes. And it's a show created by a guy named Steve Gadlin. And I recommend looking him up. He actually sold this company, Mark Cuban bought into it on Shark Tank. And it's just a goofy company called I Want to Draw a Cat for You, where he literally, people pay $10 and he will draw a terrible stick figure picture of a cat. And he just on Kickstarter, he got this thing funded. He created a guitar pedal called the fart pedal. And you plug it in and it just turns your guitar sounds into fart sounds. And it's such a ridiculous idea, but he's raised like $45,000 for it.
Oh, wow.
So this show, Impress These Apes, he actually, when people auditioned for the callback audition, it was just a comedy competition, but it had a reputation for really wanting people to be vulnerable. And they asked people to tell a tall tale. And I decided, forget a tall tale. I'm just going to tell a true story of my life. And it was, I tried to make it funny, but it was also really vulnerable. And I remember walking out of that audition because they were recording it and they didn't want any of the laughs to be on the audition. And so I just saw this room full of silent strangers as I just ripped my heart out and handed it to them. And I remember walking away going, I hope I never see any of those people again. I feel embarrassed and ashamed. And then a friend of mine was the stage manager for the show. And he said, as soon as the auditions were over, Steve walked up and he goes, all right, well, Jamie's in. Who else do we like? And so they loved it, apparently.
So having that,
and
go ahead.
Yeah, there was just something that just felt like flying without a net. Because really the worst thing that happens in that situation if somebody doesn't like the thing that you said. You know, nobody dies on an operating table. You just get your feelings hurt a little bit. So there's not a giant, you know, life altering consequence, but it still feels like you're jumping out of an airplane and you're not sure if your chute's going to open. And since then, I was like, wow, that's so much more valuable. Some sort of human connection, giving a piece of me to an audience. I want to do more of that.
And we so need that human connection. So it sounds like both escapism and just saying, you know, I'm here. And it's great to be reminded that no one's dying as a result of, you know, the horrible joke or the story that didn't land. But, you know, now that you mentioned it, so what do you do when that story doesn't land? Or how do you know that you are connecting with the audience? Because what you just said was you initially, the person said, well, Jamie's in. And you're like, oh. If that question
You know,
even makes
I've learned,
it had sound effects, Jamie.
right? You know, I've learned not to assume, because sometimes, like you know, when an audience is absolutely roaring because you can hear the laughter coming back, but you don't always know the internal monologue of a member of the audience. I performed stand up one time at a music open mic, and they're used to being quiet and just listening to each other's songs. And so everybody was very quiet as I did stand up. And I walked off thinking that I absolutely bombed. And somebody came up and they were like, that's some of the funniest stuff I've ever heard. And I was like, oh, wow, why didn't you have the normal human reaction to funny stuff if it's some of the funniest stuff you've ever heard? And I've also had shows where I thought I completely lost the audience, and then they come up to me and they talk to me afterward. And I realized that I made a connection that I didn't know in the moment that was happening. So what I've learned is, like, never assume that you are bombing. Just take a moment, stay up there with poise, realize that you don't need to apologize for being up there. You belong up there. You deserve to have your voice heard just as much as anybody else. So go ahead and say what you're going to say and take your time with it. And even if it feels like it's not connecting, if you don't act like you're failing, the audience won't know that you feel that way. And a lot of times, like, because I've seen stand-ups go up in front of other stand-ups and tell killer jokes, but we, as stand-ups, we're watching them the same way that a bunch of magicians might watch someone do a magic trick. We're looking at the mechanics, so we're not audibly laughing, and they might be doing just fine. And I've watched comedians get no laughs but walk off stage, and I go, wow, that dude's a total pro. And so just holding that poise and not apologizing, even when you don't get the reaction that you want, might lead somebody to look at you as a professional in a way that you don't realize that they're seeing.
So, Jamie, some storytellers, they come from books and they want to tell them and they go straight to their writing. And you're coming from all kinds of different ways to move inside to find that you are a storyteller. And I've seen you, as I said in the beginning, do rapid fire humor, just react and act and react. But when you moved, and you've written work that really tell the story of your life or parts of your life, when you moved from that rapid fire humor, not to say that that's not in the story, what was that
Right.
transition like to become a storyteller with, I mean, I'm not hung up on titles, but
Sure. Well, you know, there's definitely something different when you're writing something to be spoken versus when you're writing something for an audience to read it. And when I first did, like, the Devil on the Wall, the show that was very personal, that I kind of took all over the country, that had more story than stand up in it. I had originally written a blog post that was meant to be read. And when we went into rehearsals to try to formulate what the show was going to be, I just kind of read the blog out loud. And it didn't feel like my voice when I read it aloud. So we threw it out, and the director said, just tell me what happened to you. And so we would just sit for hours, and I would just kind of tell stories. And then through the muscle memory, we kind of found the voice of what the story was. We didn't even have a structure at first, we just talked. And I've learned that when stand up is the best, and when we feel like we're being sucked into a story, a lot of times we don't even realize we're hearing a story. We just feel like we're having a conversation. And so I do like to write my work, but I like to talk through it first, and give it permission to breathe.
I
Because
love.
if I don't do that, I'm going to miss out on some opportunities that would come up when I'm trying to tell the story conversationally versus if I'm trying to create an essay that somebody's going to read.
So, Jamie, I say that we have to word dance in the world before we ever handcuffed it on paper, because we can be scripted to words, but we have to play in the field that we're in. And, and so lately I've been thinking about how when you write down on paper, it doesn't have these two things: impact or impulse and impact. And I think if we play with stories as the motivator, not the denouement, the rising action, but impulse and impact. What do you think about that? And you can totally disagree
Well,
with it.
when you say that, I mean, immediately I go to this thought that uh, in every story that I've ever told effectively, I start off with who I was before this thing happened, and then you know why I wanted to do the things that I did in the story. And so when you say impulse, it's like, yeah, I was that kid and I stole a GI Joe. What was the impulse? Well, all my friends had these GI Joes. We couldn't afford one, but I'd had a friend that had shoplifted and gotten away with it, and he said it's no big deal. And so I took that GI Joe out of the packet. I wasn't even thinking about it. I just knew I wanted this thing, and I thought about how much better my life would be if I was like, I too have a snake eyes. And so when you say impulse, that immediately leads me to go, oh, what was my motivation? Why did I do that? And in order for people to understand what my impulse was, they've got to know who I was then. And then you said impulse, and what was the other word?
Impact.
Impact. I mean, almost every story I tell, you go, this is what I did, but it's got to be an important moment in your life. This is how it changed me, or this is who I am now because of it. Otherwise, I feel like, why am I telling the story? I'm not telling you a story about how I got up today and I brushed my teeth and everything was seemed to go fine. I didn't have any cavities, nothing was awkward, and then I moved on about my day. That's not an important moment. But that moment that I stole the GI Joe and then I got caught, and my mom said, just be cool. And suddenly, the mom who couldn't afford a toy for me was okay with me stealing. And now I don't look down on homeless people that get in trouble for stealing, because sometimes you got to do what you got to do to get by. Um, by the way, my mom was not cool with that. I just made that up. She was real mad.
I bet. So, as you can say, one of the key words that you said was change. And, not to put on an academic hat for a minute, but my friend Kendall Haven read 500 qualitative studies on story and said his result was, depending on what study you read, 90 to 95% of stories won't stick unless they have one thing, which was change and resistance to change. And you just echoed that. So when we're teaching that story needs to begin with plot, are we doing a disservice, or should we teach it differently? Because I know you're a teacher as well.
Yeah, well, I teach improv classes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of what we learn about literature sometimes gets brought over into our idea of story. And I don't think it's always the same. First off, any art is living if we're creating something. So there's never one right way to go about doing it. There might be a way that has been proven the most effective over time, but there are always going to be exceptions to that rule. And I think plots important, but I think more than anything, painting a picture to take somebody where we're trying to take them. And sometimes the plot cannot be as effectively told until we take them there.
Can't be effectively told. I thought you said cold for a minute. I'm like, whoa.
Oh, no, no, yeah. Yeah, yeah. Getting into that plot, if you don't know who I am, where we are, and you don't care as much
Right.
about this person, and many times it's the teller themselves or the person that they're talking about. If you don't care about that person, then that change may not be as impactful when it comes.
So when we're telling stories, we want to look for the impact to be personal. We want that significance. You have those stone-faced audiences, but those are the same people who come up to you and go, "That reminds me of my brother. He was exactly the same way."
Yes.
So every story we tell, one of my students said, has a little bit of us in it, and we shouldn't ignore that.
Yeah.
And in teaching improv and teaching storytelling, have you seen the word storytelling, at least I have, burgeon out so that it's being defined differently than it was 20 years ago. And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I remember the first time that I ever heard the word storyteller, because I never thought of that as something that someone could be. Like, I know people tell stories, but there was a guy by the name of Chuji Kingfisher, who is a Cherokee storyteller, and I was cast in my first ever professional theater production, which was the Trail of Tears drama in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. A guy named Joe Sears had come back. He'd gone to college there, and he came back to direct. If you were a theater person, you might have heard of the Greater Tuna plays, but he wrote and starred in those on Broadway.
Oh, wow.
And I didn't even know that it was like a professional audition. I was just new to town, starting college, and I wanted to meet people. And Chuji was the understudy for the lead, and then also played a main character when he wasn't stepping into the lead role. And he was a storyteller. And it was really interesting to me to watch this because it felt in a lot of ways like stand up to me. And I had not started doing stand up. And it was probably a decade later that I was doing stand up, and that term had stuck with me. And I started noticing that there was kind of a different breed of stand up. Some were doing set up punchline stuff. And then you'd also see these stand ups that would go out and do what felt like a one man show. We're laughing throughout, so it's still called stand up, but like a Mike Birbiglia that is also sharing these personal stories. And so I'm seeing people talk about storytelling in the vein of stand up comedy. I'm also seeing it in improv because people are starting to challenge what improv is, and that it doesn't always have to be laughs. And I really love the idea of going out and just being a human being, going out and being affected and changing in the same way that we might orally just tell a story, but by creating that with somebody else in a scenic way. And I'm starting to see the lines kind of change. There was a Hannah Gatsby special called Nanette that was out on Netflix that had a lot of story in it, and it also like had a lot of punch you in the gut stuff. And there was a big debate among the stand-up comedy community that were like, "Oh, is this storytelling or is this stand-up?" And I feel like sometimes we get so caught up in labels that like, does it matter? Is it worth something to you? Does it affect you? I think that's more important than whether or not it fits inside of a mold.
Well, like you said, we got to give ourselves permission to breathe. We need to give permission for an art form to grow and to be contested and to
Yes.
be questioned, but at the same time, not always legally defined. Um,
Yeah.
it's so important. So, within the context of working improv and story, how important is play in your work? I know it sounds like a crazy question, but some are just seeing you for the first time, and I know the many ways that you work with play, so it's worth
I
talking
mean, I think play's maybe the most important part of my work, because I I don't approach my stand up with it being completely written. And the same thing with when I'm trying to create a story. I maybe it's because I've done so much improv, but I like to go out and go, here's kind of what I want to talk about. Let the audience be my scene partner and see what being affected by. And if I've already got everything memorized, then my brain is thinking, especially in those early stages of telling a story, you're still trying to remember what it is that you've written. And so it becomes a lot more difficult to go out on a tangent when somebody laughs at something, or maybe an audience member shouts something out. Instead of seeing that as somebody disrupting, if I don't have this scripted out story that I'm beholden to, then I have the permission to go out and be like, oh, you just said that. Instead of that being a hindrance, it's an opportunity for us to play around, and I can talk through this thing that you just shouted out. Or I might remember something suddenly, or a detail might strike me differently in the moment, and I'm able uh, to just play with that. I also might be in one emotional state when I have the idea that I want to tell this story, but then as I allowed details to come out, and some of them may have been suppressed details that I forgot were there, and those may make me feel a different way. And if I don't believe that I have this trajectory that I must be in this certain emotional state, or I must get these details out at this specific time, then the story becomes something that shapes itself through play. And I have an end product that is so much different and usually a lot richer than it was when I sat down with the initial concept.
And as you've already pointed out, it's a living art, and sometimes, I mean, and I always question when you move to a solitary desk to be creative. Uh, you're writing a play about human connection. You're writing a short story. You're
Right.
you're trying to do a memorandum for a speech that you're going to make to people. You should practice with people, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely.
um, So, what have been some transitional moments of you looking at story differently? And if you can, put it in context. Let me know what it was that made you think differently or change the way that you react or react.
Um, there was a moment, and I think this started with stand up, and then it led into me dealing with story. But there was this moment where I realized, like initially when I started doing stand up, I thought that I would do stand up so much and get so much repetition that eventually I would be so good that I would be able to change the audience so that they would react to whatever I wanted in the way that I would be able to manipulate them. And then it hit me about probably 7 years into doing stand up, like, oh no, you don't get so good that you change them. You get so good that you allow yourself to change based on the needs of the audience. Um, and so that adaptability was a big thing for me. And also, I think there was this thing that happened when I started telling like some really deep personal stuff that got me emotional, where I realized how effective like a pause can be.
Yeah.
And also, if you're telling an audience about your pain, they care about you, and you want to let them know that you're okay. So sometimes just a moment of reassurance can allow them to go into a dark place with you because they know that you're going to take them back out of it and you're all going to be okay. Um,
And I see the work
yeah,
as
no, no, go
so
ahead.
creative, what you're just talking about. And I've always said the audience is building the story with you. Don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. And if you really allow yourself emotionally to go to the place that the story is telling the audience that they're going, and you visualize it and you let your heart kind of go there as you're telling it rather than just recounting the facts of what happened. If you allow your imagination to swallow you up as you're going, that audience will also feel that. I've learned, and I tell my improv students this all the time, the audience is an emotional chameleon. And it's like if you've ever been in a room where everything's just fine, and then two people get into a frightening argument, and that argument is over, the chemistry in that room changes. We all feel awkward, we feel weird. Um, the same thing happens when you're in a room full of people that are laughing. That chemistry of the entire room is different. And usually, the person that is up front, whatever emotions they're feeling, the person that has the attention of the room, they have that opportunity to make the entire audience feel that. And what a gift it is when you can feel pure joy to give that to an entire room so that they then get to walk out of that experience feeling that joy.
And we need that. I mean, and if I can say this, like
Yeah.
before we got on, you said, you've done thousands of shows or whatever. And, when we locked up, you came back and felt more anxiety. Do you think, like,
Yeah.
telling could release that anxiety? Or what do you do when you're nervous and you're like, oh, but you've already said this? So I guess I'm asking the same question twice, but I like the way you say it. So I want to hear it again.
I mean, you stand up there and you deliver, and you stand and deliver, just like the film. Um, uh, and sometimes you stop and you breathe. I one time, when I was doing The Devil on the Wall, I had a panic attack on stage in the middle of the show, and all of my pores in my face just opened, and there was almost a puddle below me of sweat. I'd never felt that before, and my heart started pounding out of my chest, and my throat began to close up. I could barely breathe, and I remember just going like, oh God, I don't know if I can continue this. And I just stood up there and I continued talking. I just told myself, I said, well, there are plenty of people here, so if I pass out, they'll be able to get me to a hospital. Um, and I'm just going to keep going. And a couple of minutes later, it passed and everything was fine. And I got through the rest of the show. And I talked to people afterwards, and people were like, yeah, you seemed like you were sweating a lot, but we didn't really notice it. And sometimes the audience doesn't see that. But even if they do, it's not really a disaster. There's a motivational speaker named Mel Robbins that I really love, and she talked about the idea in this seminar it was just an online seminar that I took, and it was about fighting anxiety and building confidence. And this really resonated with me, that the idea that you don't really fail. When you really decide to be all in and you try something, one of two things happens. Either you succeed or you survive. And if you survive, you learn something and you're better next time. So when those are the only two possibilities, you're going to succeed or you're going to survive, well, you're going to win either way.
Right, you're not falling out of a plane. You're
Yeah.
figuring out how to get back up again. Now, confession time. When you came in with the Stevens family, we had an all
Uh-huh.
call, and an all call is everybody comes in and you work with the improvers, and you got an audience looking. And here I am, a practitioner of play. I've written about it. I've done it for years and years. I did the all call, and yes, you all work at rapid fire, but you also work at slow place of demand. And I had one moment where I was like, I don't know what I'm doing, and they're doing it all over and coming this way and this way, and it's been a while since I felt that way. And you know what? That was
Wow.
good for me. That was very good for me because I was looking at comedy in different ways. And it probably was 10 seconds or 35 seconds, but it was enough for me to go, I can't predict how play is going to work, you know,
Yeah.
and I could study it till my eyes fall out. But uh, I will tell you this: immediately after, I was like, where was I, But then upon
Yeah.
reflection, I'm like, thanks, Jamie, for letting me look at it differently, and
Yeah.
that's
Sometimes we
important.
need a bungee jump,
Yeah.
and go, I didn't even look down before I jumped. So where am I going? Uh, because the destination, no matter where it uh, is going to be where we needed to go. Even if it's not, and we realize I don't want to go there again. We learned something about ourselves and we grew.
And I think it also hinges on what you said about breathing. 70% of all communication is in how we breathe. And one of the things that you've said at least two or three times, we need to give ourselves permission to breathe, which I love because I say we give permission to play. Um, but you said just breathe. There's so much in breathing that we underestimate. And you also talked about the pause, and that's so important.
Yeah, that's a great time to breathe.
Yeah. It's a time to think.
Hmm.
Psychologists say an active rest and reflection is when meaning is made. Think about the word active, though. When you're actively rest and reflecting, when you're taking time to think about what you did because you're actively have done it, that's when you make meaning. But we try to fill spaces, you know.
We do. We are terrified by silence. I think a lot of times because we think that if we're not talking and then no one else is reacting, that maybe we're failing. But we're not. We have to have time to digest our food. We can't just be chewing and eating all the time.
And God save the Queen, we need to say it's a good food. This is an amazing Chicago pizza.
Yeah, yeah, and you can't say that while you're chewing.
No, exactly. So, how do you make sure that you allow spaces to grow?
I think, and early on when I became a performer, I was getting on stage so often that I was forgetting to live my life.
Mm.
And, I was doing 500 shows a year and I was growing as a performer. I was growing the skill sets, but I wasn't gaining a lot of perspective. And when you're creating art is about the human experience. And if you're not taking the time to have a human experience, it becomes very difficult to connect to other human beings.
Right.
And that, for me, the times that I'm not performing, I feel like I grow as a performer just as much as when I'm on stage, because I'm gaining these experiences that I can then talk about and share with others. And I think giving yourself permission that, like, this isn't you not hustling. This is you enjoying your life, and you deserve to be able to do that. I think we have this mentality, in especially in America, where we must be constantly working, and there is this huge guilt associated with every moment that we're not, and we feel like we're supposed to be running this race. And I think it's and I may be paraphrasing it, it's one of my favorite quotes from Bob Marley, which was the moment that you stop running is when you win the race.
I like that. And we just need to do that more often. And so one of the reasons for debut is to make the invisible visible. I argue that the story making is as viable as the storytelling, and that if all we're seeing is people on stage, we're not growing within the context of the art. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like, this goes along with, I think, a lot of what I just said, in that you have to live life, and it's your life experience that is the story making, right? Because if I'm telling you a story about my life, if I didn't live my life, I have nothing to tell you other than a story of another time that I told the story, right? So um, and
But
I,
even
I
if
I
you're
think
telling a
if
fairy
we
tale, you chose that fairy tale that you told.
right, yeah, and I think allowing ourselves that time to create, and that time for it to be messy and to not be perfect, that's, to me, I don't know, that's that old quote that life's about, life is a journey and not just a destination. If we get so focused on this polished perfect end product, we forget to enjoy that part of the process that is the creating. Because that first moment when you get an idea and a spark, there's this beautiful feeling when you feel like you're about to create something that is going to affect other people, and that you've got something special. And then when you start exploring that, and then you make another discovery throughout, and I'd say don't focus so much on the end part that you don't allow yourself to have those moments either.
Ernest Morel is a literacy professor, and he says that when he walks by a classroom, he's looking for beautiful noise. And I think we can equate that to our life and art and craft. Why not make a beautiful noise? Or big trouble, as some others say.
Oh yeah, I mean, that used to be one of my favorite things. When I was in Chicago, I ran the training center at the Comedy Sports Theater, their improv training center. And one of my favorite things used to be is when a 101, like an intro to improv class, was happening out in our lobby. I used to love to sit in my office and just hear the sounds of these students as they started discovering what they were capable of. And you'd hear, like, literally the change in confidence and joy would, like, ratchet up as they got better and better. And it was always something special that I would just sit by myself and hear that. And it would make me really proud of the kind of work we were doing.
And that reminds us of the importance that we need to look at other people doing the craft, like you. And let me ask you this question: why debut, Jamie? Why be on debut? Why be on debut? Why be on debut?
Oh man, the opportunity to play is so great. The opportunity also to use this technology that we have to connect to people all over. I live in Kansas City, and even if I tour, I can only perform for the people that are in that city on that night. Oh gosh, the opportunity to play with a new story in an environment that feels like it's going to be safe, not safe in the way that like nothing can happen, like so much can happen. But I know you, and I know how much you love to play and to uh, take a story and kind of shape it and see how you can affect the teller. And I'm really excited to see how that's going to help my story get shaped. But the other thing is that, like, I get to connect. We're using technology to connect to people all over the place. And in doing this in this manner, by streaming this, I'm going to be able to connect to more than just the people in the one city that I'm in on a particular night. And that is really exciting to me. And also to be inspired by these other tellers, because every time I see how somebody else approaches story, I learn something and I walk away with a new way to play.
And we are so excited. Every time I talk to you, I learn something new. I know that you know the spirit of play, so we're just going to have an amazing time. We'll bring jazz to the play, and just rock and roll with it. So jazz and rock and roll, evidently, but we'll
Yeah.
play. Jamie, we could talk forever, but right now, you have the last word.
You guys, I cannot wait to share a little piece of my life with you this Halloween. No tricks, all treats. We'll see you at debut.